You and I are living in a world in which everything is fungible. Everything. What does this mean, fungibility? Well, if any of you people were into NFTs, then you've probably heard the word fungible, or rather its negation, non-fungible, before. Non-fungibility is the property that a particular thing in the digital sphere, an object, a file, anything really, might be associated with a unique identifier. Of course, in the context of NFTs, it is the file itself which is given the non-fungibility indication. It is not so much the actual content of the file, that is the information on it, as read by a human being or as processed by some algorithm. An example of this would be, for instance, a PNG file of a silly-looking monkey might be made non-fungible using a blockchain verification method, but the image itself, which is thereby made non-fungible, can be duplicated. You can't fudge which file is the original, but what you can do is you can extract all of the information from the file and then create an identical fungible copy. This is much the same thing that has happened to our human faces. Before the camera was invented, and the camera that I'm using now is really quite the peak of digital technology, I would say. The sensors are extremely close to reality. They have dynamic ranges which are at or above, far above, the levels that were achieved with film in the late 20th century. But before the camera was invented, our best bet at reproducing a face was a skilled painter, a person who had to learn for their entire life in order to figure out exactly how to make a realistic depiction of the human face. Now, one might ask the question, is there a difference between that, the faithful recreation of reality, and a more liberating artistic endeavor? But for the purposes of practicality, we will consider the attempt to replicate human faces as separate from what one might describe as art. And the best painters, many of them, got exceedingly close to a faithful representation of a human face. Of course, no one got exactly there. When the camera was invented, it was possible in the earliest years to make out faint blurs of rooftops and maybe landscapes and vistas, whereas faces were rendered more smudgy because our visual systems are very finely attuned to small changes in a person's face, which is why it's so easy for some people who know what they're looking for to figure out if someone has undergone a plastic surgery procedure, no matter how minor. So we are very strongly and very, very sensitive to very small changes in human faces. Why? Because it is the main way to identify a person. It has an evolutionary benefit to be able to distinguish between different people. That can also serve as an explanation as to why certain people have difficulties separating people of geographically more distantly originating races, because they wouldn't have been surrounded by them for their childhood and have therefore not been attuned to the small phenotypic differences which would be common in people of other ethnicities. But that, of course, is it's just a fringe kind of example of this general thing. After the invention of the film camera, eventually it was refined to a point where faces could be made out very, very directly using sort of halogen films, that kind of thing. And photography in the early 20th century reached an incredibly high resolution because, not necessarily because of the quality of their substrates, but because they used very large lenses, very fast lenses, and they would form the images on very large pieces of glass, and through their size, they were able to reduce the relative particle size with respect to the dimensions of the image to a very diminutive factor, and that gives you an extremely high resolution image which contains an absurd amount of detail and also degrades very slowly over time. The first digital sensors were, once again, they didn't quite start from square one, but they did manage to pack a rather small number of photosensors onto a small-ish die, which eventually reached the size of a standard sensor, what might be called as one rectangle, one exposure of 35mm film. That is still considered a standard size sensor. This one is a reduced size. I think it's 3/4. And at some point, the technology was developed to the point where where instantaneously one was able to create a faithful replication of a human face. Now we have the technology to place an existing face in any imagined fictitious scenario, and even to create faces which never existed on this earth, but ones which we still nevertheless recognize as possible faces. And in fact, probably already people have been born who will grow up to look exactly like an AI-generated image of a face which was created of an adult human being before they themselves reached adulthood. It would be quite interesting to see a person reach adulthood and be faced with their digital doppelganger who already had their face. And so the question is, there is an essential faceness to certain aspects of a visual stimulus, whatever it is. We aren't quite sure exactly how it's processed, but we know that our brains must perform some sort of convolutional analysis on the light that enters the eye, because otherwise we would have a very difficult time detecting faces or even just detecting any shape. The brain seems to favor entropically simple shapes, which is why we have such an easy time playing with straight lines and perfect pure geometries in our minds, when in fact the world does not consist of pure geometries. There are no perfectly straight lines, there are no perfect circles, the dithering that goes about these so-called perfect shapes whenever you draw a perfect circle with a compass on a piece of paper is so small that we simply ignore it. It's not valuable to us to think about the dithering, the sort of noise that arises out of a real-world process resulting in an arbitrary sort of abstract geometrical figure. When Euclid was working on his Elements, most of his work involved these figures which no human had ever seen in the real world. So perhaps there is a very pure dimension to what a human face is. There is something very essential about the dimensions of a human face which precede any biological instance of said face. We should think about that, because our faces are used as our unique identifiers. You can't look at a person's hands and figure out who they are, but once you have an image of their face, they're pretty easy to track down. And that's simply because we know we know what small differences occur in a face. But if we have figured out how to hijack that process, then even the real world is under attack by our sort of cybernetic technologies, our cyberspace, or whatever the buzzword is that you want to call. I think cyberspace is a little bit too 1990s to really describe the situation accurately. But our biological mechanisms for approaching sensicality in the real world, in the outside real living breathing world, kill all the computers, that world I mean, are under attack. And I think we should all be quite worried about that. Because now you can quite literally monopolize reality.